Chapter 341. A dazzling masterpiece. You heard what Norgem said. As soon as the clouds clear of resonance fractures, it's pretty much a green light. Lara said with a smile, patting Lannister on the back. Lannister sighed. Jay could have moved on by then. We might as well wait for the next report from William. This was a waste of time, he said, pointing at the elaborate manovs, hexagrams and other parts of the portal that were ready to send them near the Savage Lands dungeon, through an unanchored portal. Lara smiled slyly. You don't understand. When the sky clears, it's pretty much a green light, she said, winking. Lannister raised a brow and looked at her. Seeing her mischievous smile for a moment, he smiled right back. Yeah, that's basically what he said. Lara shrugged. Basically. Azra held a satisfied smile as she pulled the new leather blanket around herself and went back to sleep, satisfied after a good feed. She took more blood than usual, but Jay had just slept so he wasn't feeling too drained and began to command. Blue, hunt the firelights. Leave Red and its 2 guardians to protect me, and your 5 minions to protect the bridge. Jay was certain the floodwater would recede, so he kept the bridge guarded for now. Blue nodded, and most of the skeletons scampered off. Diving into the water, they were heading directly to their weapons, the area they dropped them earlier to carry Jay's throne. Heavy Jay glanced around and spotted his heavily armored skeleton. It was still holding Leech, the black talking orb stolen from Villator. Jay had Heavy set it down away from the shack behind a rotting log, so that Higatha's greedy hands wouldn't latch onto it, and Azra's curious eyes wouldn't gleam at it. We might actually finish my construction project today, Jay thought, seeing that his mana was full after a good night's rest. Azra was guarded by Sweeper, Higatha guarded by Dark. Jay didn't really care if either of them saw him crafting, but the more secrets he could keep, the better. Red, it's your turn to dig, Jay commanded, and began crafting at a simple shovel. Jay already had a roof with 4 beams, so crafting of 4 wall panels was a simple task, and together they both completed all 4 in record time. As for the floor panel, it had to be partly melted on each of its corners and slotted into the 4 beams, then attached, repaired, and reinforced with more triangle bone struts joined to the beams. Each edge of the cube was sealed with a healthy drizzle of melted bone, and expertly molded till each corner was square. Taking some inspiration from Leech's command key, he made sure each joining wall was refined to a perfect edge, only stopping once they had a sharp, satisfying feel when he ran his finger across, scraping the dirt and oil off his fingertip. Necromantic construction, 7%. Jay stood before his construction, and used living blueprints a few times on it, storing it in his gauntlet, and making it appear again. There was something so satisfying about watching the cube impossibly fold up into a smaller version of itself, and disappear into a sliver of green gas, then do the reverse when he brought it out again. It was a 10 by 10 foot cube, with 4 3-foot stilts poking out of one side. These were the 13-foot beams Jay had made, and were the supports to hold it above the ground. The cube unpacked from the living blueprint skill in random rotations, often falling sideways and sometimes upside down, but Jay found that he could apply a little mana and spin it upright before the blueprint skill ended and it unfolded. Now we just need a door, Jay said to Red. Red looked back, its hollow eyes offering up nothing but its detached stare. You're right. We'll need a staircase too, Jay said with a nod. The cube room was perfectly sealed at every side, airtight. Jay was tempted to drop it in the swamp to see how it would float, but for the sake of his mobile room and personal comfort, he restrained himself. Instead of crafting a set of stairs, he made a ramp. It was a simple thing to just make a smaller rectangle and meld it to the structure. As for the door, he channeled his mana into his fingertip and pressed it into the wall, but instead of pulling his finger down and melting out a rectangle shape, he stopped himself. It wouldn't have been straight. He took a step back, wondering how he would make a straight line to follow, then gave Red some commands. Red, get one of your guardians on the roof, he ordered, pulling out the length of ghost silk twine the skeletons had crafted. The skeleton sprang up and jumped onto the roof with little effort, and caught the twine. Instead of giving order, Jay glanced at Red, hoping it would understand. He paused for a moment, then frowned as nothing happened. Dangled the twine over the side and had the other guardian pull it tight. The skeletons obeyed and Jay finally had a straight line. He adjusted the skeletons so it was horizontal, or at least looked horizontal, and lined it up with the hole he poked through. Finally, he began to trace his finger along the twine and make a straight line. The rest was easy, and by the time Jay had to cut the last line to form the rectangle door, the guardian skeletons adjusted themselves. Good. Jay smiled, and a moment later the rectangle door slab of bone fell away, slamming onto the ramp and landing in the mud. Yet this only led to more problems. Attaching the door with some type of hinge. Jay never really even looked at hinges, they were something he used every day without any thought. As for crafting some from bone, he wasn't sure if he even had the skill level. He pursed his lips and scratched his chin as he looked around. Oh, right. He turned to the shack. It was decaying, old, but still had a door, and it would have used simple hinges too. Jay stashed away his construction project and went closer to investigate. The door hinge was simple. A cylinder that goes into a loop. Embark on an odyssey to the cord and €OV LS set a number. Shouldn't be too hard. I'll have a decent room, no, a house, made in no time. Jay thought. Azra didn't wake up again, but Higatha was still shifting about in the shack, and Jay planned his next steps to begin his investigations of this strange woman. Chapter 342. Final touch. Jay walked away from the dilapidated shack, plotting his next steps. First, I'll finish my portable room and workspace. Next, spy on Higatha. All while gathering more breaking shards. Come to think of it, I can pretty much run my entire operations from my private room. Jay thought with a smile. There was only a few things missing. A number of skeletons capable of lifting his room and the rest of his necromancer castle. He took out his cube room again and marveled at it for a moment as it stood a good 3 feet above the ground. He took the door slab he cut from one of its walls. Red, hold this up, he ordered, and attached some cylinders to the side, reinforcing their connections with bone. The initial posting of this chapter occurred via N0V3LB11N. Thankfully bone was light, so Jay doubted they would break. Perhaps they would grind away after some use though. He attached 3 along one side, and then to the door frame, he made some long cylinder rings for the cylinders to slot into. Basically he just made more cylinders and stuck his finger into them, making a hole, which he attached to the door. Once they were ready, he helped Red to guide the door's cylinders into the ring holes. No, it wasn't a perfect fit, but it wasn't hard to readjust, and Jay figured out the trick to connecting doors as he went. Put the cylinders in the rings, and then attach the rings to the door frame. As for any gaps, it was easy to fill them with a little bone and mana. The finishing touch was the most important. He quickly melted a bone with 2 large ends over the door, making a door handle. Nice work, Red. Jay said, nodding as he looked at his masterpiece. Red glanced at Jay as he stepped onto his ramp and opened the door for the first time. Grrr. He groaned as he pulled. It didn't swing open like he imagined. Instead he had to fight it, putting a foot up against the wall and pulling. You bastard piece of crap. He huffed and stamped his foot against it. The door opened after much effort. Jay shook his head and stepped inside the white room. He looked at the empty walls around him, the floor and the roof. It's so plain, he murmured. The only place he really wanted to look was out the door. I think I need windows, he said. But after seeing how poor his door was, he decided against it. Jay didn't want to have to bash his fists against a window just to open it. I don't have any glass either. It would have to be an open hatch. Jay frowned. As for lighting, he still had a dim luminous orb which he made a little wall-mounted holder for by the door. He would have preferred to embed it in the ceiling, but he knew it would just fall out once he used living blueprints to store the room. At least, he assumed so. Jay glanced at the empty corners of the room. Well, it's a little bare. I suppose I can change that though. He smiled. Jay got to work. He pulled out his sleeping spot, the rectangular slab he lay his swag on, and set it atop 4 tiny stilts in the corner, turning it into a bed frame. Next, a desk. He had Red dig a smaller rectangular shape, and in no time he had a rectangle bone slab. Fitting it to the room was pretty much the same as the bed, except that the stilts to support it were higher. The stilts themselves were bone, of course. Everything had to be. He joined the back of the desk to the walls in the corner, so nothing could slide through the gaps. Next was a chair for the desk, which was just a long rectangle joined to a few other squares. Jay pulled it up to his desk and sat on it. Just as I thought it would be. Not comfortable in the slightest, he said, shaking his head. He leaned his head on his palm and rested his elbow on his desk. Perhaps I should have went with the flesh path of necromancy. At least then I could have fur seats, real, living fur seats. Jay leaned forward and stuck his finger on the wall. Adding some mana to it, he cut open a tiny hole to look through. Bone isn't bad. I suppose I wouldn't be able to make walls with flesh. As for a spirit house, forget about it. Jay tried to imagine how spirit construction would even work, but then he thought of a problem. You would need spirits as building material to construct. He quickly dismissed the idea as it didn't make any sense, and once again, was glad he had chosen bone as his path. Sure, blood or spirit may have been a good choice if he were an undead monster, but he was a human. He needed support. 20x. That was fast. They found some enemies already, he said. As Jay was talking to himself, Red stood in the doorway and peeked in, perhaps curious about what his master was doing. Don't come in. Out, Jay said, holding his hand up and pointing outside. Red's body was just underwater in the filthy swamp. Not to mention its bone feet were covered with dirt. Jay knew he had already tracked a displeasing amount of dirt inside, which wasn't much, but to him, any amount was displeasing. He had a fond appreciation of cleanliness, especially after all the times his face had been covered in bile and juices. Jay held his palm on the desk and melted a shallow groove into it, which he placed Leech in. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it didn't need to be. 60x. As for his plans, the skeletons were already busy slaying more of the firelights. Now he just had to work on the next part of his plan. Red, make sure no bugs come in, Jay ordered. He took out the chair part of his throne and set it up next to the uncomfortable bone chair, resting his feet on it instead. He got comfy and leaned his head back, letting his body go limp as he pictured Dark, his assassin. Let's see what Higatha's doing with these breaking shards, he thought, shutting his eyes. Chapter 343. Rune Copy. The world turned black and white as Jay saw through the eyes of Dark, using the host skill. Dark was much shorter than the higher-level skeletons, and it only made Higatha's body look more giant and mountainous. Unfortunately, the giant moles and warts on her body were easier to see with Dark's shade vision. Higatha didn't notice Jay's presence while hosting Dark's body, even as he turned its head around, scanning the room. Broken pieces of pottery had been swept into a corner, and Jay could tell it came from smashed clay jars, as many of them were still standing around the room in the corners, along the walls, and on shelves lining every surface. Why would she need hundreds of clay jars? Jay thought. He knew she kept her food in glass jars upstairs, so his only guess was that these were for spell ingredients. Either that or she has a pottery hobby. As for spells, Higatha was chanting something as she sat before the stone altar holding an amber sphere, a breaking shard. This strange altar was the only thing in the room apart from a mirror on the wall and hundreds of clay jars covering the walls. Jay watched as Higatha continued to chant, and the mirror teleport flickered. Some leaves appeared from the mirror and coated the amber sphere. As she brought the leaf-covered ball closer to the altar, the leaves began to steam. She placed it down as the leaves sizzled. The amber shard melted with the leaves, and Higatha leaned closer as a string of smoke began to rise. The amber fluid melted a chunk out of the altar, and together they both disappeared, leaving no liquid behind. It was like it had become one of the acid-filled shards that Jay had scavenged. The smoke changed from a thick whiteness to a bluish glow of mana released from the melted dent, and before it could flow too far, Higatha suddenly breathed it in deeply, taking a deep breath, and not letting any escape. She sat there for a while, holding her breath as it absorbed through her lungs. Dark tilted its skull to the side, Jay watching through its eyes, both of them curious about what would happen next. Higatha leaned back from the altar, gasped for breath, then took out another amber shard, and began chanting whatever spell or monocraft this was supposed to be. With "Thou must rest," she repeated the process. Jay turned to the mirror on the wall. It was more interesting than whatever this ritual was, and Higatha still had 50 of the orbs to get through. Dark stepped closer to the mirror, its nimble step silent in the underground room. The mirror, which was a two-way teleport between the shack above, was a special one. In its reflection Jay could see a larger skeleton standing over an old table with a new leather blanket on it, Sweeper and Azra. But what made it special was how it teleported. Around the edges of the mirror were a series of symbols, and the only one that was different was one at the top, a triangle with a vertical line going through it with a circle on top of the line. Runes, Jay wondered. 2 other triangles were etched into the wall but were faded and empty. Obviously, the mirror teleporter didn't need whatever those ones did. Well, since I have the time, I might as well. Using Dark's eyes, Jay committed these strange symbols to memory, hoping they were runes and not some other kind of magic resonating language. He returned to his body and began to scratch his gauntlet's claw into his desk, etching down as much as he could, before venturing back into Dark's body to record more of them. Each time he came back, he added more of the symbols to his desk. Jay began to notice some repeating symbols. Then after a few trips, he found that they were in sets of 7, repeating around every side of the oval mirror. As he went around, he found that these sets were all the same, all 7 symbols the same except for one at the bottom, which was an infinity symbol with a vertical line through it, almost like 2 balls on either side of the mirror. The infinity symbol and the triangle symbol were the only ones that weren't in the repeating sets of 7, meaning Jay only needed to copy 9 unique symbols in total. At first, Jay was copying the mirror's shape when he etched away, but decided not to complete it after he found the pattern. After scratching the infinity symbol into his desk, along with a set of 7, and the triangle symbol at the top, Jay leaned back, scratching his chin. He turned to the black orb on his desk, leeches. The initial posting of this chapter occurred via Novelbin. Leeches, you said you can read runes. Yes, Jay. The little black orb said. So, are these runes? Jay said, tapping his desk. A small part of the cube raised up with a tiny round hole in it. But what it said next made Jay frown. Error. Occipital functions degraded. Vision failed. Repairing. With a sigh, Jay closed his eyes and leaned his head back in his chair. How long until you fix your vision? Hello. Leech. Vision 3% repaired. 100% repair requires additional mana. Must suspend memory recall and repair. Jay plucked up the talking orb, and it closed its single-eye port. He stepped outside and handed it to Red. All your mana. Now. Jay pointed. Jay would have done it himself but was low after crafting 4 wall panels, a floor panel, a ramp and everything else in the bone room. Not to mention the host's skill, which burned through mana. Red plunged his sword into the earth and clutched the orb. A cloud of mana appeared and quickly mixed into the orb, its surface becoming clear for a moment. Good. Jay nodded at Red, taking the orb back. Now, what percent are you? Jay asked Leech. 3% repaired. Current mana reserves are sufficient for the entire process. Tell me when you're done, Jay said. The watched pot never boils. Jay thought, pursing his lips as he went back inside. He placed it back on his desk, leaving it be for now. With a desk to study at and time to kill, Jay decided to make the most of these few quiet moments, making the most of his short time here. He took out something he had been saving for a while, and began to study. Chapter 344. Necrotic Whispers. A few hours passed in the misty swamp. 585, exp. The skeletons made good progress over the course of a few hours, and Jay had recouped much of his mana pool. The storm cleared and the fog had risen again, returning the land to a thick gloom. It was hard to tell if the waters had begun to recede, but now that Jay was on the floating island it didn't matter. Red fervently stood guard outside Jay's new house. It sent its skeletal guardians back to guarding the bone bridge, but thankfully there were no signs of the bone-eating creatures anymore, not after the massacre and the storm. As for Jay, his head was finally safe from any raindrops, wind or bone-eating eels. Leaned down over his desk, he was happily studying intricate patterns in a hexagonal honeycomb prism, which had tiny artery-like tubes passing through it. Skull shield projector research 33%. It was delicate, so he took his time. The hexagon was a piece of bone he had pulled from a skull shield projector, and studying how it worked was the first step to helping him make his own, or at least his own version. Currently, his scrimshaw skill was not high level enough, but that didn't mean he couldn't gain research in this intricate craft. After spending a few hours he found patterns in its structure. The arteries in the center were slightly thicker than the ones in the outer shell, but as these arteries went upwards, they branched off and fed into the smaller ones, getting smaller as they went until they all became as tiny as hairs. Skull shield projector research 34%, 35%, 38%. Jay gained more and more insight as he studied it, and tried to visualize how mana would flow through it, picturing it like a river. It's like the main channel feeds all the smaller ones, shrinking and branching into nothing. Skull shield projector research 40%, 41%. Finally, inspiration struck. It's like a reverse river. Normally rivers form after a bunch of smaller streams combine into one, but this is backwards. The energy flows up the thicker arteries, branches off and turns into tiny hair-like filaments. So maybe the shield is like the clouds, Jay said, glancing outside at the fog and water. If the water is forced up the rivers, up the streams, then where would it go? The rain. The clouds. It's like it forces the clouds into existence, making them thicker until they can block out the light, Jay said, slowly nodding. Well, except with mana instead of water. Critical research. Skull shield projector research 65%. Critical research, Jay said, and raised a brow. Did I just critically hit research? He let out a chuckle and wondered if there were ways to increase his critical research chance. Probably by wearing glasses and walking around holding books, he thought, lightly smiling. I think that's good progress for now. How long was I studying? Jay lay his head back for a moment and massaged his temples, relaxing his mind after a good 2-hour study, though he felt like it was 30 minutes at most. But when he checked his mana and found that it was almost full, it confirmed it. He stashed away the skull shield's hexagonal core and left his desk. Stretching his legs felt satisfying after a long study, and he went outside and stood with Red for a moment. Blue, send archers back, he ordered, and then talked to Red. So, how are things going out here? Red turned its skull towards him, stared for a moment with its hollow eyes, then turned away and kept scanning around the swamp, looking for threats. It was as diligent as ever. Yet Jay kept chatting to it. Ah, good. I've been making good progress inside too, Jay said with a nod, and watched the swamp waters with Red for a while, saying whatever came to mind while the skeleton listened. Maybe. Some of the grasses lining the island's edge uncoiled and lashed out, catching stray bugs escaping from their flooded nests after the deluge. Others evaded the carnivorous reeds, only to turn and feast on them in return, a vicious circle of life, a small circle, but a circle nonetheless. Finally, some ripples appeared in the water, followed by a torrent and then a splash. A white skull rose from the depths, its ghostly eyes the only light that escaped the darkness. Archers returned. As for its purpose of returning, it would find out soon enough. Jay began to take out some bones from his ring-knot Helvetian skeletons, but parts of all the other specimens he'd slain along the way. Silt wolf bones, a soprat skull, Perton wolf wings. For good measure, he threw in some of the black marsh bones, along with the remains of a large crab shell centipede that had washed ashore. Stand here, Jay said to archers, pointing at his mismatched pile of bones. The skeleton didn't hesitate, but perhaps it should have. Jay chose this nimble skeleton, which was still level 1, for one specific reason. It required less mana to summon. Since Jay had upgraded Summon Feeble Creature to summon lesser undead, he didn't need to worry about using smaller skeletons anymore either. It'll be over before you know it, Jay said, winking. He watched its hollow glowing eyes for a moment, and it almost seemed like he would enjoy what he was about to do. A sly smile formed, and he slowly raised his gauntlet. Snap. Jay snapped his fingers. Archer's body fell apart. The dark green joints turned to ash and left another skeleton behind. Jay plucked some of the Helvetian skeleton bones away, ensuring that when he summoned, it would use the other bones from many different creatures. Needless to say, the skull shield projector was not the only thing he would research today. The only difference was that this required mana. A string of necrotic gas left his gauntlet's fingertips and mingled with all sorts of bones, selecting suitable ones for necromancy purposes. Twisting and popping cartilage, melting bones and joining, jamming and fixing them to each other. The rat skull took its rightful place, crowning the multicolored body, which had a few different colored claws at its fingertips, most of them blue. Chimera research 32%. However, its glorious form was short-lived. Snap. The bones fell back to the cold mud, only to be twisted, abused and used again. Chimera research 33%. Chimera research 34%. Jay unsummoned and resummoned without concern. Each time, archers came back different. A mashed mess of different body parts. The only pieces that didn't mingle with the monstrosity was the crab shell centipede. I guess shells don't count as bones, Jay thought, but continued his merciless summoning. Chimera research 37%. A steady stream of floating ashes began to drift out of the bone pile, from the mana that filled gaps in the bones, flying off into the swamp. The bone mass was slowly being used up. Each twist, mold, pop and jam causing more of it to grind away, lost to the harsh summoning process. Yet this was a simple fix, as Jay simply added more of the various bones, aiming to keep an equal ratio between all types of corpses. Chimera research 39%. With his research going smoothly, Jay began to notice changes, patterns, or perhaps it was something that was there all along. He just didn't have the knowledge to grasp it, or the trained eye to see it. The stronger blue bones seemed to nearly always form the claws, lower spine, neck and shoulder joints, while the weaker bones formed things like the ribs. He wouldn't have noticed if they weren't blue in the first place. One of the two lower leg bones, the tibia, was blue most of the time, while the lower arm, also composed of two bones, used at least one blue bone, too, preferring the stronger radius over the ulna bone. The shin and the lower arm bones. Interesting, Jay thought, his eyes narrowing inquisitively. It was obvious that his own necrotic mana was revealing something to him. These were the parts of the skeleton that needed the stronger bones, the most reinforcement. The majority of the claws being blue was also a pretty clear sign too. And with this realization, his understanding took a giant leap forward. Critical research. Chimera research 59%. Twice in one day, Jay said. Yet this also caused him to wonder about how research worked. He had gained it previously without even looking at the skeletons when he used mass summoning. Without even thinking about it, he had gained research. Jay gazed down at his gauntlet, fingers flexing slowly, the sharp claws a testament to the mountain of corpses he stood atop. He nursed a small ball of glowing necrotic gas in his palm, mesmerized by the eerie green glow that flickered like ghostly flames. A single question lingered in his mind, taunting him with its insistent curiosity. How did the magic know where to place the harder bones? Can mana learn? Does it think? It seemed so scandalous to even consider, but as he studied how the skeletons could learn without minds, how they communicated silently, how he could sense their presence, he couldn't shake the thought. Jay took a deep breath in, trying to calm his swirling thoughts, stopping himself from jumping to conclusions. The mana knew where to place each bone, how to make them stronger when it made them. It learned and passed it on to me. I gain experience when they kill things. When I formed the skeleton's minds, maybe all I was doing was connecting my mana with reality, bringing it a step closer to understanding the world. Another step into the world. Jay whispered to the green orb in his hand, making it shift around his fingertips, stretching it, and making it dance across his gauntlet. This dark green energy was the force that guided his necrotic powers, like a mysterious entity that possessed a keen understanding of the skeletal anatomy. As he held the mana, he felt a connection with it that went beyond control, a symbiotic relationship that made him wonder if he was merely a vessel for its power. The thought of being a puppet sent a chill down his spine, like an undead hand lightly tracing its cold fingers over his neck, pulling and swaying him, manipulating his thoughts. But he couldn't help but wonder if this was really just a deeper part of himself, pushing him forward. After all, his eyes had seen numerous skeletons slit under his butcher's blades. I control it. It's a part of me. But is it me? He wondered. Ash from the bones floated around him for a brief moment, a reminder of his own fleeting mortality, pulling him from his existential panic. Jay dispersed the mana and lowered his gauntlet with a final thought. Whatever this is, it will outlive me. The link to the origin of this information resides within NOV Euros LSZN. Chapter 345. Azra's Frailty. Archers lay as a mismatched pile of bones at Jay's feet. Jay had plenty of mana left, and he wasn't even feeling drained from re-summoning it numerous times. It only needed 5 mana to summon, and Jay still had over 90 to work with. Satisfied with how much he had learned, he gave himself a break and used mass summoning, dumping the rest of his mana into the pile of bones. The energy coalesced into a dense orb that crackled with necrotic power. The bones, like lifeless twigs, began to stir and rattle, awakened again by the power that surrounded them. This was the most Jay had dumped into the mass summoning spell, and slowly, they lifted into the air, their pale surfaces aglow with the eerie green light that flickered and danced through them. The floating bones orbiting the nest felt familiar, a pleasant reminder of his necrotic ring. Of course, as a gauntlet with thousands of bones inside, it was too risky to shift it into its orbital form. It would probably cause another storm. The bones floating around the nest of mana began to merge. Hang in there, archers, Jay muttered, feeling a wobble. His mana reserves had depleted rapidly, the strain of the spell weighing heavily on his mind and body. Jay stepped onto the ramp of his single-room house, sitting in the doorway and watching the spell work its wonders. I wonder if Archers gets a different class after all this abuse, Jay thought. Archers appeared before him, its bones clattering and clicking as it rose into the air. He wondered if the poor skeleton was feeling the effects of the constant unsummoning and summoning, but with a single thought, Jay mercilessly willed it to unsummon again, its form dissolving back into the bone pile. To automate the process, Jay made a second bone pile nearby, filled with another assortment of obscure bones from different creatures. Every so often Jay motioned for Red to toss a few more bones into the mana well, trying to keep the ratios of odd bones equal. Jay was determined to learn more about his craft, the pursuit of necromancy, so even while he was lightheaded, he continued to watch intently as the bones shuddered and shifted, waiting for the next cycle of summoning and unsummoning to begin. NEO v Euros Rapture marked the initial hosting of this chapter on NEO Circumflex v Euros LSZN. The day marched on and Jay leaned back, watching the spell like it were crackling fireplace rather than the dark, abominable offense of raising the undead that it actually was. After a lunch of unidentifiable meat, Jay planned to spy on whatever Higatha was doing in her basement. After Archer's body rose and fell like the lapping waters, Jay gained 18% more Chimera research, bringing it to 77%. When Archer's rose the few final times, the different bones assembling its body had become distinctly distributed, each of them finding the perfect place in its body like it were a pattern coming together each time, and it made the skeleton appear as if its own body had a mirror image of itself going down the center. The Chimera skill was developing, so Jay's mana gradually mastered the perfect bone placement and distribution. Jay gained enough mana to use Host, but before using it, he glanced at the shack, hearing something. Deep creak sounded. Jay sensed Dark's presence above ground. There was movement inside. Jay stood in his own doorway, watching while he idly chatted to Red. Seems like she's finished melting the breaking shards into that black altar thing, Jay said. Red glanced up to Jay, clacked its jaw once and turned to look back at the shack. Jay looked at Red and raised a brow, guessing that Red said yep in its own way. I better check on them, Jay said, turning to his bed. Red nodded and stood guard at the door while its master lay down. Jay wouldn't enter Higatha's shack voluntarily. Dark and Sweeper were still assigned to guard Azra, so he wasn't worried about her safety either. He simply wanted to host to avoid Higatha and her nauseating abode. Azra's eyes were gently clasped shut, dreaming of sweet sunlit meadows or cold stone castles plunged in shadows, but even asleep the vampire's awareness was sharp enough to sense a husk drawing near. Especially such a large one. Before Higatha's sausage-like dirt-covered fingers could stroke her hair again, she snapped her eyes open, abruptly sat up, staring at Higatha. Here too, huh? Azra said, her mouth slowly opening in shock. Higatha had changed. Her skin was clear of moles, with fewer freckles. Some of the bumps and lumps across her neck had either disappeared or deflated. Her blackened Higatha slyly smiled as she walked past Azra, who couldn't help but ask questions. What happened to you? You're cleaner, Azra asked. Higatha replied with her lips curled in a proud smile as she walked past. None of your business, she said, as if it were matter of fact. Even Higatha's voice had changed. It wasn't so raspy and biting. There was a subtle, gentle sweetness in it. Azra thought it was similar to the alluring voice she heard from the previous night. The one that sent a shiver up her spine, the voice Higatha used to lure someone or something. Higatha crushed another writhing piece of meat and chewed it down, so she wasn't too different. With a piece of slimy meat dangling from her lips, she lumbered over and sat by Azra's side, still chewing. Azra squirmed out of the blanket and pulled herself away on the table. I feel much better. You don't have to. Nonsense. Give me your leg. I have a deal with Jay, Higatha said, pulling on her clothes. Some leaves fluttered down from the ceiling into her palm, which she quickly crushed and swallowed with the remainder of the slimy morsel of meat. Sweeper tilted its head to the side, and stepped around Higatha to see better. Azra looked up at the skeleton, sighed with a frown, and gave in to Higatha's demand, not wanting to ruin Jay's plans. Besides, the wound was still a scarred mess which pained her whenever she bumped it. She needed more of these special healings. With a frown, Azra looked up into Sweeper's ghostly eyes, hoping it could at least tell Jay of her suffering here, but she also didn't want him to see her sorry state. I'll just need to trust him, Azra thought, looking at Sweeper tilt its head and look around more than it usually did. Him and his weird skeletons. Chapter 346. Empty Control. Higatha chewed on leaves, ignoring the bitter tang while feeding the energy into Azra's wound. Azra gasped as her skin began to tear and knit back together, and after a moment her furrowed brows softened in relief. Higatha breathed out slowly, her body feeling lighter. She jumped to her feet, not exhausted like she usually was after one of their healing sessions. Higatha exited the shack, feeling the sticky mist on her skin. The fog was back. More sticky and smelly than it ever was. The rain and flooding somehow made it worse. She looked around the shoreline, about to run some errands on the island, but her gaze landed on a white object. Jay's bone room was hard to miss. As she drew closer, she realized it was a giant white cube. Her steps slowed as she approached the giant object, wondering how it could have washed up from the storm, or how it could even exist. It was much too large to store inside an inventory. Each of her heavy steps were measured. The skeleton standing at attention outside the white box came into focus, its skull swiveling back and forward looking for threats. It was clear that Jay had already claimed the cube. The skeleton guard suddenly twitched, its skull clicked and locked onto Higatha. She narrowed her eyes and took another step forward, defiantly challenging it. In response, its body snapped into a combat stance. Red raised its shield and crouched. It planted a threatening step forward, its bone foot stamping into the mud and kicking up muck, while pointing its sword as a warning. Higatha halted in her tracks. Red's shining armor filled with awe and splendor was arrayed against her. But Red was not the only skeleton on alert. Behind her, Sweeper still followed, but like Red, its stance also changed. It was crouching as if about to strike, its bone sword pulled back alongside its chest and ready to spring forward, the tip pointing perfectly at her spine, as if it had done this a million times. Higatha froze and held her breath for a moment, not wanting to test the creations of the one supplying breaking shards. The tension was palpable as her arm hairs raised. One step too far would be all it took. She leaned back and dragged her foot backwards over the dirt, and the skeletons went back to normal as if nothing ever happened. The debut release of this chapter happened at NEOV Euros LB1N. She quickly left the strange structure, glad she didn't anger the undead any further. Thankfully, their forgiveness was as decisive as their aggression. Higatha went to check her 2 traps and gathered whatever else she could from the shoreline. Mushrooms, driftwood, reeds, stones, clay, bugs all had a part to play in her purposes, and she usually considered them prizes after the storm swept them up, but ultimately they paled in comparison to getting more of those sweet, sweet amber shards. Walking around, Higatha flexed her legs and stretched her shoulders back, feeling much more nimble than usual. The twinging pain in her knee and the dull ache in her shoulder disappeared after absorbing her powers back from over 50 shards. She knew she would get more of them, and at any cost. If he cares about healing Azra's shifting wound, then there will need to be more wounds, she thought, her lips curling slyly. Smiley's rapier sliced through the air with a swift, controlled motion, the blade flashing as it tore through a jagged bamboo face of the demon. The creature's yellow spines and green body shattered into 1,000 splinters, falling to the ground with a soft rustling sound that echoed through the silent forest. Smiley stood there, watching as the remains of the demon scattered in the wind. With a calm, measured gaze, he scanned the forest, searching for any signs of movement, making sure it was safe before he turned his sword away. At his side was only one student, Loki, who looked down the edge of Smiley's sword, which was now pointing at him. Smiley's eyes glared at him, filled with murderous intent. "That's 3 levels. My warp charge. Now," Smiley demanded. The rapier was held perfectly still. He was not only able to slay Loki, but willing. Smiley had no problem taking out another weakling, another reminder of his own weakness. Loki kept calm. Without even stepping back, he raised his palm, and the miraculous object appeared. Shaped like a wooden keg, its sides were jade green glass, while its ends were sealed with a deep green lichen metal. Inside the glass cylinder, powerful energy hummed away, though it seemed like 2 energies rather than one. In one moment the energy was an orb of lapping blue waves, in the next, it was a red lightning storm of chaotic crackling power. The 2 energies fought each other for existence, but neither side could win. Smiley's eyes widened and he paused for a moment, enthralled by the unending battle of the energy barely trapped behind glass. His sword even lowered by a hair's thickness, perceptible only to himself. Seeing Smiley watching in awe, Loki's cunning grin began to show itself. 3 levels for this thing. Pretty good deal, huh? Loki said. Smiley ignored Loki, lowered his sword and reached out. But Loki pulled his hand back. "Wait a second. You need to ask yourself something. How did I get this warp charge to enter the dungeon without anything happening?" Loki said. Smiley's eyes narrowed with suspicion. He grabbed Loki's arm and spoke slowly, his voice lowering into a threat. "Don't waste my time with bullshit. The container in your inventory stopped it. Now hand it over." Loki took a nervous breath. Sorry. Just look, to use it, you need to extract it first. And I think we both know what you're planning, but you still need to extract it, otherwise you won't get anywhere. And I can make that happen," Loki said with a nod, but then his face twitched in pain. Smiley began to squeeze and Loki let out a whimper. Falling to his knees, Loki handed over the warp charge. Smiley's lip curled as he gazed at the warp charge in his hand for a moment. This object was a trophy to his freedom. It disappeared into his inventory, and he released Loki from his grip with a push, sending him falling into the splintered bamboo. Know your place, Smiley said, narrowing his eyes with disdain. He willed to exit the dungeon, and as the dungeon exit surrounded him, he left with a final comment. If I need you again, you'll serve me. Loki frowned, pushing himself off the ground and brushing off the splinters. Dazed, he stood in silence, then his brows crunched, his teeth clenched in scornful anger as he whispered. Scum. Outsider. Non-variant, prisoner scum shit. He looked out into the bamboo forest and screamed, know your own fucking place. His voice echoed, and a sound came back from the forest. A cracking branch. Some bamboo trees shifted. Loki's eyes widened and he willed to leave the dungeon before another bamboo demon answered his call. When he got outside the dungeon, he was surprised Smiley wasn't there. He assumed Smiley would be experimenting already, and he scoffed. Idiot. Loki murmured, and headed back to campus grounds, kicking rocks as he went while he planned his next moves. I'll get Heather whatever stupid trinket she wants. Then Smiley will come back, and I'll ready to bargain for more levels with Heather in my pocket. Loki said, nodding to himself. He left the forest the dungeon was in, and saw the Third Academy's pointed stone towers and castle windows, each of them giving off a soft glow, inviting him home. But before he could find Heather, something attacked. Thud. A heavy blow landed in his guts. Loki curled and fell back, his head hitting the dirt. Crack. A blow landed in his stomach as he clutched himself on the ground, tasting blood while a whispering voice came to his ear. You said you'd steal Azra's weapon, the faceless voice said. Loki frowned and didn't bother getting up. Instead he continued to cough, letting spit drip from his lip in an attempt to look weak. But he wasn't worried. He made many empty promises, and knew this invisible person was here to collect on one of them. The invisibility power was one he used to steal the warp charge. Loki coughed out a plea. I'll get it, I just need more time. Please, I can get it faster with your power if you want it faster, Loki said, holding his arms across his belly, bracing himself for a beating. A few more kicks to the body, some begging, along with spit in the face, and it ended. I lend you my power once more, but if you don't get it, I'll send the others after you. The others were a secret student club that originally started as a few friends having fun. One of these variants were be able to temporarily transfer the skills of one person to another. Because of their mischief in times past, each member of the group had their powers blocked while on academy grounds, so they could only negotiate and transfer their powers to others if they really wanted something in the academy. This was how they got their name. The others. Sounds of footsteps left. Loki was left alone, yet even after the beating he began smiling. During the assault, he had not only bought himself more time, but he even convinced this person to lend him their invisibility powers again. Of course, he wouldn't be using them to steal Anya's powerful crossbow. No. Loki could snatch that any time he wanted. What he needed was more warp charges. Loki already had a good understanding of Smiley's character. Smiley was someone who relied on himself. He would try, fail, and then he would need more warp charges. Only then would he listen to Loki's new scheme. Chapter 347. Stepping Out 1. The wooden door slammed open, and Lara stomped her feet into the teleport area. Lannister, the resonance cracks, there Lara blurted, pointing at the sky, but Lannister didn't even look up from the elaborate runes and glowing mana-filled diagrams in front of him. He raised his hand, hushing her. I know. Are you ready? Lannister said. Lara paused her march, checked her pockets and her inventory one last time before replying. I've been ready since yesterday, she said, sighing. Good. We're leaving. Lannister proceeded with the teleport ritual, stringing together the magic, measuring distances in his mind's eye, connecting his teleport spell to 2 of the 3 warp charge conduits in the mirror reality, which bonded the mirror reality to the real world. The magic came together. An infinitesimal point of nothingness tore a vertical line into reality. Spinning at unimaginable speeds, chaotic energy bore a hole open, bringing a silvery mirror into existence. Lara pulled out a communication crystal, informing Norgrim of their departure. Hi. It's Lara. You said we could leave when the resonance cracks disappeared, so we're leaving to hunt, find Jay. What? Lara, you. Norgrim's voice began to hum back through the crystal, but Lara pretended she heard nothing, and continued to chatter. We'll wait an extra few days in the real world before returning, to make sure the reality keeps stable, she said, and while still holding the communication crystal in her hand, she jumped through the silvery pool. Lannister held a regretful smile as he looked around the teleport area one last time, then jumped through after her. Real world somewhere near the Savage Lands dungeon. Gus kicked up and swirled around the bright portal. A violent crackling noise came from the edges of it, which was like a lightning storm around the silvery calm surface. A gentle ripple gave way to a communication crystal, the dainty hand grasping it tightly in anticipation. Lara appeared with a sly smile, her eyes scanning through the root-covered forest for any signs of movement or imminent danger. Lannister stepped out behind her. He clicked his fingers, and the portal began to shrink, disappearing into a warping ripple in reality, until all traces of it were gone. The dirt and dust that swirled around like a small whirlwind fell to the ground, the violent humming disappearing with it. Finally, we're back, Lara murmured, her eyes still scanning the forest. Lannister nodded, and pulled out a small pouch. It looked more like a coin pouch, but Lara knew exactly what it was. Lannister reached in and pulled out 3 large white seeds, then scattered them across the forest floor as he talked to Lara. Jay probably went south, so we'll head that direction. The Orin will find him once they grow, Lannister said. Lara nodded, glancing down at the white seeds. They had already begun burrowing their way into the roots they landed on. These seeds were the Orin, a magical creature bound to serve whoever sows it. The Orin were not a product of the Academy, but were actually traded from one of the Dimmerkin clans. Once these white seeds were matured, they would grow a single large flower which bloomed, and from inside it, an Orin would leap out made from soft flower petals and colored shades of brown like the bark of trees. It was a cat creature. Grown in a flower's scent, it had a keen sense of smell, and its light, nimble form of luscious petals allowed it to quietly slip through forests with the speed of an arrow. Unfortunately, they were only good for tracking. Made from the most tender petals of flowers, their lives wilted away all too soon. The novice bounty hunters Link, Vanderby, and Estra continued their search for Jay, whom they still assumed to be level 9. Can we stop here? Estra said, wiping a drop of sweat from her forehead as she climbed atop a larger root. It's not that dark yet. We can definitely make it across the valley before nightfall. The trees are just thick here, so it seems darker. Vanderby replied and pointed up at the green canopy, covering them like a thick curtain. The trio had made it through Hollow Forest, passing the empty Bloodvine Bear's territory, and entered the sprawling mountains that were crisscrossed with a maze of valleys and streams, the soil covered by its own carpet of roots. Link nodded along with Vanderby, and pointed across the mountain. Yeah. And if we make it across this valley tonight, the sun will wake us up tomorrow morning, Link said, pointing at the mountain above them, knowing it would block the morning light if they stayed here. Estra nodded, but her blank face and tired eyes gave away her reluctance. She heard Jay's heartbeat growing louder with each hour they traveled. They were homing in on Jay, and keeping a good pace, so she didn't see the harm in resting, even for a little while. Despite being novices when it came to traveling, they were doing well for themselves, and doubted Jay could escape. He was alone and level 9 after all. Little did they realize just how fast Jay could travel once his skeleton parade began, carrying him at a jogging pace even while he slept. Together they trudged downhill, which became steeper as they went. Using the sloped wall of roots as ropes, they climbing down to the bottom of a root-covered canyon. The roots hung down but barely touched the bottom, giving way to vertical faces of cliffs and giant boulders. They chose a bad place to cross, but going back was as hard as going forward. SHH. Link whispered. His eyes narrowed. Further down the canyon, pebbles tapped and fell. Something shifted in the shadows. Link suddenly gripped his sheath, pushing his curved katana up by a thumb's length. Lower your heads, Link whispered again, and the other two immediately obeyed. Crack. A dash of golden light bounced through the canyon, finding a target. Slender fingers, like wandering black fishing rods, all fell to the ground. 3 large black hands cleanly severed at the wrist, spurting blood covering the cliff faces. Link successfully struck first. From beneath giant boulders and deep cliffside cracks, more of the long black fingers began to emerge from shadows. Get to the wall, Vandy said, raising his shield and dagger, standing in front of Estra. The debut release of this chapter happened at NEOV Euros LB1N. Link's flash step skill had sent him about 60 feet down the canyon. His blade dripped, his hands shaky as he looked back. He sprinted back towards Vanderby and Estra. More black fingers emerged from nowhere. All of them feeling and seeking, tapping and scratching. The tapping fingers swept the ground and found the severed black hands. They clutched them, ripping them away with so much speed they were gone in a blink, barely leaving a trail of blood into the cracked shelves of the canyon. Link sheathed his sword and bolted back to his comrades, running as fast as he could before the fingers could return to find him. As for his comrades, a slender finger slowly danced across the wall and closed in on Estra. Dong. Vanderbee's shield pinned it against the cliff. It writhed against the rocks which grazed it back like sandpaper. Van's dagger cleaved, but needed 2 swipes to carve through. Unfortunately, a dagger was not a suitable weapon for such creatures, and neither did it pair well with a shield. Another searching finger came close, creeping from above towards Estra's hair. Estra fell down, pushed by Vanderbee before it could touch her. Vanderbee desperately swung around, looking for the next tapping fingers near them. How long? Vanderbee yelled down the valley. 14 seconds. Link yelled back, jumping away from a shadowy vein in the walls. Chapter 348. Stepping out to. Vanderbee yanked Estra's wrist, pulling her up. A finger tapped across where she had just sat, lightly rubbing and scraping the dirt as it went. Further down from them, Link dashed over slender black fingers, but was forced to stop his sprint back. From opposite cliff faces, a number of fingers had found each other, gently rubbing one another, intertwining and making an impassable mesh. He turned back and saw one at his ankle, already tapping his shoe, rubbing it to feel its texture. The other fingers of the black hand came wrapping towards his ankle like a closing snare. With 2 hands, Link brought his katana down, haphazardly slashing clean through the black finger. His blade's tip sparked against the stone as he jumped. The other black fingers closed in, capturing the freshly severed one, and before Link's feet landed on top of them, the hand snapped away, disappearing with its prize in a blink. It wouldn't take long till its wounded hand would be back, searching with a vengeance. Crunching bone sounds came from the walls. Gritting his teeth, Link ignored his disgust, looking for a way across. But his eye caught sight of a severed hand, the one he had cut when using his skill. It was his ticket out of here, though there was competition for the morsel of meat. One stray finger had already began to tap it, gently nudging on the severed hand, trying to get a response. Link's eyes bulged as more fingers joined in. They recognized their own, but only for so long. They would realize this was severed flesh, and it would disappear soon. Come on, shit, come on, Link thought. Link was only a few steps away, but more of the wet fingers began to probe their friend, nudging and pulling. They realized, and sprung like a trap. In a second it would disappear. There was no time to raise his sword. Link pounced forward, bore down with his sword, pushing his hand on the back of the blade, and crashed onto it with his weight. His blade didn't cut all the way through. Brah. Come on. Link pushed his knee on the back of his sword, digging it through the creature's hand with all his might. The snare closed. The entire severed hand suddenly tugged, ripping away with so much force that Link was flung towards the cliff. His shoulder dashed against a rock. But this was all he needed. The hand was torn in 2, leaving Link with a chunk of the palm and 2 of the long fingers. Ignoring the pain, he pushed himself up, taking his prize away before more of these slimy tappers could come seeking. He hurled the piece of slippery flesh into the mesh of weaving fingers that blocked the way. The bleeding black hand was like an unwelcome guest as it limply fell on the others. It was like it had intruded on an intimate dance. The fingers on either side of the cliff slowly unlaced themselves from one another, taking gentle care. They snapped around the unwelcome one. Each of them tugged on one of the 2 remaining fingers, and as they found resistance, they suddenly ripped it apart, splitting it through the remains of palm. Each side disappeared in a flash into the opposing cliff faces. For only a moment, a mist of red blood linked each cliff together, floating then disappearing. Crunching bones sounded again. Link gave each side one last glance and rushed forward again, back to Vanderbee and Estra's side. A single dark finger found Vanderbee's ankle. Van hacked it once, but the other fingers were already closing it, snapping shut. Link's eyes bulged and he shouted again. Now. Link screamed, seeing Vanderbee about to get snatched away. Link gripped his katana, sweeping it back to prepare for the swing. Vanderbee and Estra knew what Link's call meant. They lowered their heads, as if they were submitting to a higher authority. Link's eyes blazed and his sword and body alike turned into a golden flash. Crack. A gleaming burst of golden light lit up the canyon, bouncing across the canyon walls like jagged lightning. Hundreds of black fingers all froze. Link stood in the middle of them all, flicking the blood from his blade. All of them fell at the same time, their wrists severed in perfect harmony. Huff, huff, huff. Link stowed his sword, then gave in to his exhaustion, bending over onto his knees, panting. Nice one, Link. Vanderbee called. 27 seconds. Link waved, just in case. He said, calling out the cooldown of his only skill. Vanderby nodded back and began to stomp his shield onto 5 fingers wrapped around his leg, freeing himself. Esther was breathing fast, holding a spear she normally used as a backup weapon, which was even more useless than Vanderby's dagger. The inaugural upload of this chapter took place via N0V3 Leaders B1N. The 3 of them had their own strengths, but they were far too mismatched to be useful. Unfortunately, they were forced to become bounty hunters because of their mismatched skills, useless for most dungeons. Vanderby had an odd shield and dagger class. He was like a tanky assassin, which made him the worst of both roles. Link, while powerful, only had one skill: Flash Step. His class had given him nothing else, and no other skills. It was up to him to make the most of it, and Hona Link had learned that using the skill without a weapon in hand gave him temporary invisibility, but it came with drawbacks. It had a 30-second cooldown, and if he couldn't sever whatever his sword touched, the skill would end. As for Estra, her pseudo-love type class was useless in combat. Her skills were entirely human-centered, suited for a city and climbing social ladders rather than a dungeon. Of course, she was considered non-variant because her weak, long love magic only affected her. After sweating for a moment, Link checked over his battered sword, blunted and dented from scraping against stone, and with a frown he joined the others. Without wasting more time, they clambered back out of the canyon, the fingers below them slowly emerging again, and snatching away the fresh platter of severed hands. Link climbed first, followed by Estra and then Vanderby. Getting further up the slope they sat, recovering for a moment. However, Estra remained standing, glancing around the trees, her eyes darting around, nervous about what else may be out there. She was having doubts about the journey, but seeing how hard Link and Vanderby had worked hard just to keep her safe, she kept them to herself. Scanning the forest with her eyes, she saw something. Eyes, she said, stepping back, pointing into the forest. It was dark, bouncing between the trees. Link stood, readying his sword again. It came closer and hid behind a large root. The only thing sticking out was a pair of ears, twitching left and right, each ear looking like brown leaves. "What is that?" Link said. A little kitten suddenly bounced onto the root, making the forest seem like it was its own little playground. It cooed and let out an innocent whimper. Mew. Yet none of them lowered their weapons, waiting to see what it would do. The little orange kitten stretched, curled into a ball on the root and closed its curious eyes. Its mission was complete. A gentle breeze drifted through the woods, sealing the end of the day as the cold air worked through the forest. The little orange petals began to sway in the breeze, falling apart and drifting into cracks between the roots like a fading rose as its body fell apart, into petals carried by the wind. Chapter 349. Lannister 1. A dark rose petal fluttered through the trees like an aimless butterfly, and while its movement was erratic, it moved in one direction. Lara and Lannister sat by a small campfire, quietly hobbled under a rocky ledge. Through the darkness, the dark petal found its way home, and landed on Lannister's lap, as if it were making itself comfortable. Lannister gently grabbed it and gave the petal a rub. The petal gave up the last of its magic and slipped away, sending him a single message. A location. Anoran found someone. A little further east. Lannister said, watching the petal turn to dust in his fingers. Lara didn't look up from the fire. Seems like he didn't get far. Yeah. We'll probably need to apologize and explain about what happened back in Losla. Have you tried to contact him? Yeah. I don't think he's been charging the crystal. Either that or he's quite mad with us. Lara said, shrugging. N0V3 was the platform where this chapter was initially revealed on N0V3LB1N. I can't say I blame him. We did kinda ditch him, Lannister said. Lara's brows furrowed. I already told you, that fucker Matheson showed up. How was I supposed to know what he looked like? Then the mage hunters began their assault. I'm surprised we made it out. Lara huffed. Relax. I'm not blaming you, no one is. We'll bring Jay back this time, Lannister said, patting Lara's shoulder. Lara mumbled, still glancing into the fire, and floated another chunk of wood into it, slowing rotating it as she held it in the flames. He stood with his back to the fire and looked east for a moment. He made it this far without us. As long as we bring him back, we'll finish the mission, Lannister said. Lara frowned and raised a brow, wondering when she became the serious one. Lannister sat by her side, his elbow touching hers, and he watched the soft flames for a moment before saying something. How many missions have we done together? I don't know. 20. Lara replied. 28. Lannister said. Lara shifted her gaze to Lannister, noticing the thoughtful expression on his face. She followed his line of sight to the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle. What's on your mind?" she asked, turning back to him. Lannister hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I was just thinking about all the things we've been through," he said, his voice soft. Lara nodded, her mind briefly flashing back to some of their past missions, the close calls, the moments of triumph, how Lannister was like a fussy mother keeping her in line, and everything in between. "Yeah, we've certainly been through our fair share of challenges," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. Lannister softly murmured, his gaze never leaving the fire. Lara glanced at Lannister and felt a strange pang in her chest, but she wasn't sure why. Was it the memories of their past missions, or the way Lannister's face seemed so familiar? "Is everything okay, Lannister?" she asked, sensing that there was something more he wanted to say. Lannister's eyes flickered with emotion, and for a moment, Lara thought she saw something vulnerable in his expression. But then he seemed to steel himself, his features hardening, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Everything's fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking out loud, I suppose." Lara didn't press the matter, sensing that Lannister wasn't ready to talk about whatever was troubling him. Instead, she floated more twigs through the fire, trying to relax as she played with the flames. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest around them. Lara watched as the fire burned lower, the embers glowing softly in the darkness. She felt a sense of contentment wash over her, despite the frustration she still felt about the mission. Finally, Lannister spoke up again. "Hey, do you remember that time we had to cross that rickety old bridge over the river?" Lara grinned, a rush of nostalgia flooding her. "Yeah. You were shaking like a leaf the entire time." Lannister rolled his eyes, but there was a hint of amusement in his expression. "I was not. The bridge was just shaky." "Yep, then it collapsed. I recall saying you should just teleport us over." I don't recall that." Lannister smiled, and Lara shook her head. They continued reminiscing about past missions, and Lara felt her tension ease slightly. But she wondered if it was tension between herself and Lannister, or about the mission. Maybe it was just her imagination, but she thought she saw a glimpse of something more in Lannister's eyes, as they talked, something that made her heart skip a beat. But then he looked away again, and the moment was gone. As they settled down for the night, Lara couldn't help but wonder what was really going on in Lannister's head. She was determined to find out, one way or another. "I'll get to the bottom of this. Maybe he wants a new partner since I failed. Whatever. The mission comes first." Lara thought, her eyes closing for the night, and as she listened to the gentle burning sound of the fire, the gases hissing out of the wood sounding like a breeze going through the treetops. She thought of herself like an old dog being given one last pat and one last treat before meeting her end when Lannister would ask for a new partner. She didn't want this to be her last mission. Several years prior, 3rd Academy, MR number 34. Boom. The dueling arena shuddered as the crowd watched in fearful silence. A large null-stone block meant to be covered crushed down onto a student, the block sinking inches into the dirt with the flattened person underneath. Lara narrowed her eyes and watched, levitating herself in the air with her gravity magic. But the block never moved. The crowd of students watching gasped as they felt the ground shift, then erupted in cheers. The arena stands burst into a roar of victory. An announcer's voice called from communication crystals mounted around the stands. "Lara did it, she defeated Hawker. With that, we have our duelist selected for the solo war game trials. May she bring us victory this year." The crowd chanted, "Lara, Lara, Lara." Lara, still floating in the middle of the arena, looked around at those calling her name. They looked so unfamiliar to her. She had just come to this school a few months ago, and now they called her name. Something about it was insulting. She never shared her name with them, so how dare they use it? She didn't frown or smile, and floated down to the arena exit, ignoring the calls of people who presumed to know her. She had training to do. Chapter 350. Lannister 2. ZZZZ. Lannister grinned, watching the portal humming with raw power. A few weeks of experimentation passed, and Lannister found his way into the mirror reality. He kept coming back, drawn to this dungeon entrance, since his teleport mana resonated with the strange energy linking it to the mirror reality. It was purely coincidence that he chose this dungeon entrance to toy with, this dungeon that kept the mirror reality in place, and aligned with the real world. It was like a bearing, or an anchor in reality, holding its existence in fixed space. Responding whenever Lannister tested it, he continued to probe and experiment until it finally cracked open. A shimmering silver portal circled with chaotic violent energy, a tunnel directly into the mirror reality. Normally portals did not hum dangerously or have such luminous crackling energy around its edges, but sensing some stability in his new portal, he eagerly tested it. First a rock, then a branch which he pulled back through, and some time later his own hand. Sensing its stability and knowing it would close soon, he grit his teeth and nodded to himself. Just do it. He coached himself, and leaned into it. Lannister stepped through, let out a sigh of relief, and began exploring the other side. But there was something so boring about it. The other side of the portal offered no sense of adventure to speak of. Walking through a forest, similar to his own of towering giant evergreens, hearing the familiar creaks and croaks of ancient trees which mirrored the forest he left, he wondered if he actually succeeded in portal travel to another world, or if he just made a fancy-looking mirror to step through. All the trees were giants, some of the bigger ones half a mile high, all of them filled with different climates and ecosystems, as you ascended if you would bother to ascend. As he strolled along the forest's dirt floor, each step squishing moss or leaves as he went, he began to doubt himself, and decided to turn back to the dungeon for some more testing of the portal. Yet he was stopped in his tracks. Lannister turned back, only to find a blade pointed at his neck. The original appearance of this chapter can be found at NEOV LS set 1N. A small dagger, the double-edged blade silver and sharpened, behind it a black grip. A simple design. Yet there was no hand carrying it, it simply floated there, pointing at his neck, despite having no obvious runes or enchantments. Fuck, cool. He whispered. Lannister didn't feel threatened, instead he leaned on one foot, stepping to one side and the other, curious about this magic dagger, as the tip of the blade followed his movements. The dagger pulled back for a moment, only to recoil. Swoosh. I think you should take a look at. The blade shot forward. Lannister dodged to the side and narrowly missed losing an ear. The dagger gave no rest. Small, it easily spun back around and shot back again. But Lannister didn't dodge. He held his right hand forward, his fingers flayed out and his palm open. The other hand he held facing a tree. Just before the dagger bore its way into his palm, both of his wrists suddenly flicked, rotating. Shimmering portals opened in his palms, and swallowed the dagger before it could slow down. THWNK. The tree became the dagger's only victim, cutting an inch-deep hole into the wood. Lannister hastily grabbed it, holding it still so the pesky little thing couldn't escape. He felt a strange force pushing back against his fingers, but he pushed harder, locking it in his grip. Just give up. You're mine now. Mine. You hear me? Lannister called at the dagger, bringing his mouth close as he yelled at the metal, hoping whatever sentience this thing had would recognize him as its new master, and to his surprise, the force pushing his fingers back stopped. But what was stranger was that he was able to store it in his inventory. Oh. Lannister raised a brow, looking at his empty hand in the hole in the tree for a moment. Good. He said, nodding. Lannister wanted to immediately take it out, but wasn't going to risk losing such a miraculous item. He already began to think of ways to release it inside a wooden box, or somewhere he could trap it in case it decided to defy him. Hearing another groan of a tree trunk, Lannister crouched, silent, scanning for more threats. It was apparent that he in fact was in another world. He cautiously stepped around the tree, using it like a shield to hide behind, and holding himself close while doing a quick scan of the forest, looking for any other floating weapons that may decide to attack him. So, I traveled to another world. Floating weapon world. Lannister thought, naming his finding with an excited feeling growing in his stomach. He wanted to cheer, shouting his discovery across mountain tops, but decided a world filled with floating weapons. I could sell them, once I think of ways to control them. I'm going to be so damn rich then I can fund more adventures into other worlds. I'll make an entire industry of floating weapons. Ah, I didn't even consider how this is going to change dungeons, the world as you know it. But how many of these weapons can I subdue? Saving his mana for the return trip to his own world, Lannister swiftly retreated back to the dungeon, treading lightly as he kept his senses sharp. His portal had closed, but he knew the connection was still there, a single thread connecting worlds in a dormant state, waiting for him to force it open again. However, before he left the forest, his body became light as he leaped across roots. His feet made less and less contact with the ground, as a mysterious force made gravity dry up until he found himself floating. And then, he heard a girl's voice. Don't try anything, she said, others are already on their way. Lannister looked up to the sound. A girl floated further above him, watching him with a deadly stare, her eyes sharp as she watched his every movement.